Welcome to this month's edition of African Liberty Webinar. This webinar, as with the last one, are dedicated to sort of assess the continent's response to the coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19 outbreak in Africa. And as you know, one of the most ill-prepared regions, unfortunately, for a pandemic of this magnitude and this, sort of novelty is sub-Saharan Africa, frankly. The total number of confirmed cases globally is now above 3 million, with more than 220,000 people, unfortunately dead. In Africa, though, more than 34,000 people have tested positive for COVID-19, with about 1,500 deaths. So joining us for this discussion to help us sort of make sense of what is going on across the continent and how the continent is handling the issue on the one hand, and on the other hand, evaluating the state of the rule of law and related issues surrounding liberties across the continent are Bright Simmons, Honorary Vice President at Imani Africa. Bright is an active member of various World Economic Forum communities. He's a TED and Ashoka Fellow and a Brain Trust member of the Avian Group at IMD. He's a recipient of numerous awards, ranging from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Award, Maria Corey, and Commonwealth Vision Grants to PPARC Scholarship in Gamma Ray Astronomy. Dr. Denis Foretia is a friend of the organization, and he is the executive chairman and founder of Cameroon's leading think tank, Nkafu Policy Institute. They are doing a remarkable job. He's a leading surgeon in Africa and in the US, and doubles as president of the Association of Cameroonian Physicians in the Americas, ACPA. And Martin van Staden is the head of legal policy at the Freemarket Foundation in South Africa, one of our closest partners in spreading freedom across the continent. And Martin is also the author of the 2019 book, Constitution and the Rule of Law, an introduction. I admonish anyone to kindly grab a copy of that fascinating book. So I want to go straight to Mr. Bright Simmons. I don't know if you can hear me. Yesterday, the AU had a virtual mini summit, urging leaders across the continent to be more on top of the situation, so to speak, and what could stricter measures regarding mobility and lockdown compliance mean for Africa?
Thank you, Ibrahim. Obviously, we could take this from several angles, but the key issue is whether the infrastructure of African cities enable governments to lock down and unlock cities in the same way that perhaps they are able to suppress economic activity and then liberate economic activity. They are not the same things. And the pornographic implications of locking a city like Lagos or a city like Accra is extremely complicated. And therefore, we've had a challenge where, though suppressing economic activity has not been so difficult, locking cities, the pornographic impositions that are being contemplated elsewhere simply don't work because of the nature of African cities. If you think of it, for instance, only 18% of Ghanaians have an indoor toilet. It's as simple as that. So when you say people should stay home, it's very often you mean they should stay in their neighborhood as opposed to they should really stay home. And what that means has been very difficult for a lot of African policymakers to tease out. And the challenge that has arisen, therefore, is that they will suppress economic activity, all right, and see a contraction in the economic, the size of the economy as well as in economic growth, but they're not necessarily going to stem the spread of the disease. And this double jeopardy that I guess the likes of the AU are yet to completely avert their minds to.
Martin, in South Africa, recently we saw a surge in the number of cases in your country. First of all, I think it was yesterday that there was about 345 or 54 new COVID cases reported in South Africa, which was about 37 or 73% rather increase from the previous day, which brought the total of cases in your country to about 5,300. And last week in Cameroon, the number of cases also jumped sporadically. So I want to ask you, Martin, your country seemed to be among the, the African countries with high number of reported cases. And we know South Africa is quite, good and competent when it comes to, health, health administration, so to speak. But we haven't seen that replicated in this case. So what do you think South Africa is doing at this point? What is it doing wrong? Why are we seeing all this number of deaths and complained by media medical experts in your country?
The first thing we should note is that the recorded number of cases only reflects testing. So in the Western Cape province, there's been a big rollout in intensive testing for the coronavirus. And that has probably contributed significantly to the rise in cases. So I don't think we should read too much into how many cases there are. I think the number is far higher than what the numbers currently reflect, and we'll just get closer to that as we continue testing. On the health front and the capacity, I think South Africa may, I only know about South Africa, but it may have one of the better infrastructures on the continent, but that's not saying much, given that the infrastructure is still quite very poor, especially the state public, the public health sector. Of course, due to years and decades of government mismanagement, corruption, etc. So that is going to be a big problem. The health minister and everyone has said that the majority of our deaths are going to occur in a few months. September is the month that keeps being mentioned. So that is when we foresee the virus to really start hitting South Africa hard. And I think that is testament to the fact that we need to now make our peace, so to speak, with the fact that this is going to be devastating. South Africa has one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. There has been very, very little economic activity. Billions of rands are lost every day in the economy. And we came into the COVID-19 pandemic already in a recession. So it's time to make our peace with the loss of life that is coming and open the economy back up. It's time for us to start trying to mitigate the long-term consequences of what is coming. And government, of course, is largely to blame for having so squandered its opportunity over the last few decades to build up a proper healthcare sector. Instead, it's been pursuing silly ideological goals, but it is what it is. And now it is seriously time for us to open the economy back up. And this sham of an easing of the lockdown that's starting tomorrow, apparently it's being eased, but who knew? It doesn't seem like that to me. That needs to be scrapped, and there needs to be a serious easing.
So, Dr. Foretia, I want to ask you this question. So last week, Cameroon saw about 1,000 new cases, and today there are over 1,800 COVID cases in your country. So these spikes in the curve, of course, seem to be the case across the continent, which points to one thing, that Africa is approaching its peak in the number of cases. Well, you've traveled across the continent, and you have an idea of the medical capacity of certain countries in handling outbreaks of this magnitude. So the question here is, how do we survive this? And what would you tell many Africans who do not know what this means?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you all in this very important conversation, conversations that are happening throughout the world, and as Africa grapples with the debilitating effects of COVID-19, I think we are still at the very infant stages of trying to understand the real impact of this pandemic. Now, there are a couple of things that you've highlighted. The number of cases first. The Cameroon. We have Martin here and myself. We are leading the continent in the number of cases so far, at least cases that have been identified. After South Africa, it's Cameroon on the continent, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are a couple of things. One, regarding the issue of testing, most of our cases, we didn't have the test kit. So a lot of countries waited for the initial donation from the Jack Ma Foundation to actually have test kits. The Africa CDC had given each country some test kits, but it wasn't substantial enough. So right now, at least for most African countries, they do have test kits to test about 20,000 minimum 20,000 folks. Now, how well are they doing that? Is another problem. In Cameroon, for example, most of the testing has been focused on in the major cities, Douala, Yaoundé, and now it is being decentralized to some of the other regions. As of today, all regions in Cameroon have reported cases. The last region was reported, the far north region reported its first case a couple of days ago. But the belief is still that we are under testing. We are not testing enough. That's the first thing. Second thing is, what is our capacity, to deal with medical health capacity to deal with this? We know that even though the African continent has a good experience with the Ebola virus, and the Africa CDC was an offshoot of the Ebola virus. The Africa CDC has helped the continent tremendously in helping to prepare, even though it's not at the level in which we want. But bottom line is this. We know that from what we see in China, South Korea, Italy, the United States, France, Germany, we know what how people react to the coronavirus. 80% of folks would have a mild case and would not require oxygen supplementation. So that is what's out there. In advanced economies, 15% of cases will require some form of oxygen supplementation. And 5% of folks would require some form of mechanical ventilation, artificial ventilation for you to actually, go through. Now, off the back, Africa, we can provide some degree of oxygen, supplementation, given the fact that we don't have a cure across in the world as of this moment. But the 5% of folks who would require mechanical ventilation, we should, those patients are most likely not going to survive. So there is the whole aspect of natural selection that's going to play out in most of Africa, because the folks who require the mechanical ventilators would not be able to get it. And it's already playing out in the deaths that we are seeing in Cameroon and other areas in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So bottom line is that this is going to be tough. Most people are going to survive based not on support from medical establishment, but just from natural selection. And the few that would be hospitalized and will have some mechanical ventilation, we know that the fatality rate for those who get on mechanical ventilators is very high. It's more than 50%. So that's where we stand. So the bottom line is that we have to be able to identify cases quickly from quick and widespread testing, do contact tracing, and be able to prevent as much as possible, but we cannot really manage it medically.
You just made mention of the issue of contact tracing, which of course is turning a lot of people apart, freedom lovers and people that, are very sort of realist in this sense, saying, you need government to do more contact tracing, go after people just so we can get out of this mess. And there are people that, think that such measures are anti-freedom. So that's going to bring me to the question for Bright. So Bright, Ghana is leading in tests and tracing with over about 110,000 people already tested for, the virus. But with tracing, people have taken to social media to complain about how this policy could give security agencies leeway to subject the public to comply with certain directives that are, basically overreaches of, state power. So, Bright, is this something that Ghanaians have to worry about?
Fascinating question. Ghana is leading in testing because Ghanaian scientists decided to try a very well-known and almost ancient, days back to the 40s method, but that has not been used for COVID-19 so far because of the pathophysiology of the disease, because of the fact that its molecular virology, all of those things are not entirely certain. So we haven't, most countries haven't done it, but Ghana has very rapidly moved towards using pooled sampling, which means that they combine the samples taken from multiple individuals into one sample. And then, so they group them into pools. So let's say you have 100 people, they group 10 samples together, and then they run the tests as 10 tests. So instead of 100 individual tests, they run 10 pooled tests. And if any of those tests come back positive, it's only then that the specific pool that was positive is then individually tested. So by doing that, they have dramatically expanded their capacity without necessarily investing in additional resources. So that is just by way of context in terms of understanding why Ghana is so far ahead. Other countries are following the Africa CDC's guidance, which is not to start with pooled sampling so far, but the results speak for themselves. And obviously there is now room for people to start to think about whether there's capacity to do more screening. Now to your more substantive and much more interesting question, about the role of liberty. I'm surprised, not surprised, but, almost sick, of all the references to biopolitics that, this crisis have spanned on the internet. So everybody now has dusted their Foucault, and they are reminding us of, terms that we've all forgotten years ago and thought was not necessary. But I think the idea of bio-oppression, the very possible reality of bio-oppression is interesting. And rather to describe the theoretic behind the potential bio-oppression, I will describe the mechanics of how such a thing might work. So we are in a stage where currently it is entirely possible that for this particular disease, remember, this is not necessarily the most fearsome disease in the world, nowhere near as bad in terms of prognosis as Ebola, and nowhere near as infectious in some instances as tuberculosis, depending on the context. But because it's a novel virus with no clear-cut therapeutic path, though we are beginning to see some of the antivirals that are being tested show positive results, it certainly has created room for a lot of fear and panic. Now, by bio-oppression, what I mean is that it creates room for arbitrariness and unfairness, because the government takes control of the nature of managing the disease. If you had TB today and you lived in Ghana, you could go into a private lab and do a test and walk into a private clinic and get treated. If you catch COVID-19 in Nigeria, it is literally against regulations to be treated in a private hospital. That is the reality. And in Ghana, no one will treat you without necessarily there being an express regulation against it, because all the dynamics have been created to make sure that it's a state-managed disease. Now, in those contexts, it is very easy to see how the government, through its regulation and rationing of access to therapeutics, of access to vaccines, of access to testing, has complete biopolitical power over the population. And therefore, in that regard, we have to guard against one thing, actually two things. One is arbitrariness. And this is where, for someone like myself, who is a liberty lover, as you pointed out, I feel that the rigidity of science, on the whole, on balance, is pro-freedom, in the sense that it reduces the arbitrariness that governments can act. And therefore, it changes the site of our activism and the site of our protest from the national theater to the international theater, because the governments of Ghana, Nigeria, and the rest apparently are completely bound by WHO dictates. So it means, therefore, that if we all of a sudden began to take an increasing interest in international technocracy and started to influence international technocratic norms, it is possible that it reduced the arbitrariness with which governments could overreact. That, of course, does not stop the fact, as you probably will explore later on, that there are non-pharmaceutical interventions, outside therapeutics, vaccines, and the like, where governments also have arbitrary power. And this is the area of relief, particularly social relief for the poor. The degree to which government control and management of this disease gives governments unprecedented power to manage dissidents means, therefore, that we must rapidly move towards private testing, move towards a regime of private treatment in private clinics, so deregulate the management of the disease, and enable a radical transparency framework in which people are aware of the risks that they can take and therefore choose whether to take those risks or not. I think those are the three critical things we can do to sustain liberty.
Well, anyway, I'm going to come to Martin now. This all discussions about contact tracing, privacy, individual freedoms has led many people to ask the question: how do we protect the rule of law in a pandemic like COVID-19 when it's, first of all, necessary to have stronger central coordination on mitigation? People believe, okay, there should be some stronger central administration to mitigate the spread. But again, how are we going to protect the rule of law in realization of this
I
fact?
think the first place always to start is vigilance. So I'm quite happy to hear that in Ghana and West Africa, at least, people are complaining about contact tracing, because in South Africa, and I'm not kidding you, everyone has bent over backwards for what government is doing. They are completely infatuated with how great our president is in announcing these restrictions, despite the total confusion that is reigning at the highest levels of government, with ministers contradicting the president and the president contradicting ministers. Everyone is completely in favor of what government is doing. There are some quibbles about details, of course, but in principle, people seem very, very happy they see it as give up some of their freedom, but what they're doing at the end of the day is giving up the freedom of the poorest in our country, who live in 2-by-2 meter shacks, who cannot comply with the suburban lockdown restrictions that have been imposed across the board. So I am very happy to hear that at least somewhere in Africa there are complaints, and that is where it starts. That is how you fundamentally protect the rule of law, and that is with eternal vigilance, very active civil society, and I would say extreme skepticism of government. Do not trust anything that government says. Do not trust anything that government does, even though it might be justifiable and necessary. Your first port of call must always be skepticism and total opposition to whatever it is politicians are proposing. That is simply where a civil libertarian has to start. But then the next step, of course, is our constitutions, and I can only speak to the South African constitution, which is quite clear about under which circumstances rights may be so-called limited, and then when they may be suspended in times of national emergencies. And governments need to stick very religiously to those prescripts, which is something that in South Africa I don't think has happened. So we haven't done contact tracing as much as we probably should. Now, there are many privacy concerns around contact tracing that I definitely won't detract from, but it's a balancing act. We need to decide what will be the least restrictive way of combating the spread of the coronavirus. Now, some of us may say that government has no role whatsoever in even being involved in the control of a pandemic. The market needs to take care of that. I don't know where I sit on that, so I defer to the Constitution. And on this topic, I think contact tracing, which is provided for in the regulations, but which isn't really happening all that much, is is far less restrictive than the other things that governments have been doing, especially the South African government, which is to prohibit restaurants from operating, and recently, very absurdly, to prohibit e-commerce. So you can't order something online and then have it delivered to you, because apparently, according to our Minister for Economic Development, that would be unfair to all the other businesses that are closed down. So now we have to close down e-commerce as well. That's the state of the rule of law in South Africa. Totally absurd, clown, comedic circus happening at the highest levels of government. But if we could say, okay, let's do contact tracing, but then get rid of these other nonsensical interventions, I think many liberals would say, okay, that's better. We're not going to let up criticizing government. We're not going to let up saying this shouldn't be happening in this way, but that would be better. And I mean, that is fundamentally what protecting the rule of law comes down to. In my book that you described earlier, I do go into a lot of detail about what the rule of law is in theory and how it plays out in practice. But on the ground, when the knife hits the meat, it is simply a vigilant citizenry, very active civil society, and an extreme skepticism of government. Do not do this we are led thing that has been going around, heaping praise on the swift reaction of government and saying this is great, finally there is some political backbone. No, we should be very, very concerned when there is a show of political backbone, especially in Africa and especially in South Africa. I think governments are using this as a test, and it's been very, very easy so far. There has been jubilation and joy at these restrictions. And I think that even after COVID-19 is over, governments are going to remember just how easy this was, and they're going to use that. And we should be very, very mindful of creating that precedent here.
During the time of crisis like this, especially during, outbreaks of diseases or, natural disasters, governments explode. It creates a lot of agencies and it never shrink. So you're absolutely right regards that. But I want to go quickly to Dr. Foretia to sort of, talk about a quite interesting aspect of this whole COVID-19 thing going on in Africa. So there are now rumors about the possibility of Africans having certain immunity to this strain of coronavirus. What can you tell us about it, Doctor? What do we have, or is there a reason to believe that Africans can exhibit some sort of immunity to this virus? Because a lot of people are actually define the lockdown based on this reason alone.
Ibrahim, thank you very much for that. But I think that falls into the category of many of the myths that we've seen with the coronavirus. And the myths are not surprising, especially because of the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty. Whenever there is uncertainty regarding pathophysiology, it gives room for every Tom, Dick, or Harry to have a say as to what they think is going on. And so you've seen a lot of this, myths, spread very, very wildly. I mean, the myths as to Bill Gates being involved, 5G being involved, myths regarding specific portions that people make that they claim is full treatment for COVID-19. So this goes on and on. And you've also seen in many situations where authoritarian regimes are using some of these myths, to their benefit. There are folks countries, Turkmenistan, and for example, where they don't even, they're not even allowed to say there is coronavirus, so the absence of even the pronouncement of the coronavirus is to give the impression that it doesn't exist. So there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation campaigns. And I join Bright in saying that science and evidence is very pro-liberty. At the end of the day, the ability to be able to figure out what is right or wrong, what is correct, not right or wrong, what is correct, and going after that is very pro-liberty. And I think that's one of the things that we need to emphasize on. Invariably, during pandemics, there is always a tendency for leaders to grab power. That happens. It's an innate reaction. It's an innate reaction to say, this is a problem. I believe that this is the solution, and you want to ram that down people's throats. But the rule of law is extremely important, and I'll make another argument that this pandemic is showing us the real importance of the rule of law. This pandemic is showing us the real importance of it, and I'll start by China. Now, China is where invariably, the coronavirus started to spread. And today, the Chinese government has reported approximately 80,000 cases or 90,000 cases of the coronavirus. And the coronavirus started in a city of about 30 million people, in a country of 1-point-something billion people, in a bustling city where, the trains and the airplanes, allow for real mobility. And at the time when the transmission of the virus was not well understood, And if you compare that with a country that like the United Kingdom, which is about 65 million people, they have reported more cases of the coronavirus than the Chinese government. Now, who do you believe? Do you believe that the numbers from China are correct? If there was the rule of law in China, we would have people would have sounded the alarm a lot quicker. The media would have been on cases. Hospital administrators would have sounded the alarm as to what's going on. The rest of the Chinese, the entire Chinese government and the country would have been better prepared. Would have taken measures preemptively to curb the spread and ensure that it doesn't spread like wildfire the way it has. So the absence of the rule of law in China has led us to where we are today. And I think this is a very good example as to why the rule of law is extremely important. And I would say that the rule of law, it's like democracy. At the end of the day, the fact that you have diverse voices and an impartial legal system where judges can adjudicate cases without partiality ensures that we can check each other and make sure that we force our governments to respond quickly and in the most appropriate way. And I think this is one of the things that we must learn. Even though authoritarianism is easy for people to grab power at this stage, we need to really fight back, because in life it's always that fight between democracy and authoritarianism, and it's a perpetual fight, so to speak. So I think the China example is a very good reason why the rule of law is extremely important.
I want to go quickly to Bright on the same issue of conspiracy theories and helping Africans understand the whole thing. You recently wrote an article in the Africa Report, and in that article you sort of attempted to bust the myths of all these conspiracy theories. So first of all, can you help us understand some of these myths or some of these conspiracy theories?
Thank you, Ibrahim. My interest when I wrote that article was to try and approach some kind of general theory of why conspiracy theories tend to proliferate. And there has a connection somewhat to some of the epistemological discussions that we've had about the limits of knowledge and the likes of it. My view of the matter is that increasingly every facet of reality can only be completely understood from multiple disciplines. So if you're looking at a pandemic, one of the difficulties that have arisen is in the beginning, the tendency to concentrate on public health and epidemiology without understanding all the contributory disciplinary dynamics that shapes the pandemic. So people think, for instance, that the use of some of the data points that are being distributed nowadays, whether it's positive case rate or whether it's case fatality rate, any of these numbers are perhaps similar to interest rates or to any of these other macro-fiscal indicators that all of us have become quite used to tracking in order to understand our society. Unfortunately, they are completely different. They are different in their etymology, they are different in the way that they are constructed, etc. But you need to have a fairly multidisciplinary perspective to understand it, which is very difficult to acquire. So what happens is that very often people get fragments of data from different disciplines, and in order to integrate those into a holistic picture of the reality they are confronted with, they look for simpler explanations. So if somebody has heard, for instance, that 5G, which is one of the conspiracy theories that are circulating, the 5G networks are potential instruments for spreading COVID-19. They first of all start understanding what is the connection between telecom masts, radiation, and health. And unfortunately, you are talking about at least 7 different disciplines right there. You could be an expert in one, possibly, but certainly not an expert in all 7. So the quickest way to integrate these fragments of data is either to be really, really diligent and to read widely and deeply, or to go for 2 coping mechanisms. In one coping mechanism, which is what a lot of normal people in the world do, is you just trust authority. So you just say, okay, what is BBC, CNN, everybody else saying? that must be the truth. And then you go up along with the rest of your life. If you are somewhat more skeptical, you can say, well, I don't have a view on it. I just don't know enough, but I'll be practical. The challenge with some people is that unfortunately neither of those two work. So in their skepticism, they look for explanations, integrated explanations, which are offered by conspiracy theories whose explanatory theories are simpler. So when somebody says, look, we've got this 5G terminal here, and then this other thing then happened, and this other thing then happened, you can go check all of that yourself. Or you can say, well, I don't believe that because some authority said that is not correct. Or you could say, no, this other person gives a much more convincing explanation, and it kind of links everything together for me. So I think this is an interesting point around how we segue back into the conversation on liberty, knowledge, and science, which Denis kind of started around. I believe that to the extent that we understand science properly, which is that it's a heat map of where the truth appears to be hidden, and therefore there are systematic rules of how you evaluate evidence and the likes of it. It's not necessarily the content of science which is most interesting, it's the process of science. The idea that it informs skepticism, the idea that we're trying as very much as we can to be consistent, have internal self-consistency, etc. Those processes, to my mind, if we actually pay close attention to them, could be anti-authoritarian. A lot of people, on the other hand, only focus on the content of science, which nowadays have been projected as authoritative, and therefore makes the possibility of dictatorships much more easily. I mean, we saw it with eugenics and several other episodes in world history. So my argument will be twofold. One, people will continue to look for theories that integrate different facets of reality into a holistic picture, because that's what we do as humans. We are pattern hunters. We hunt for patterns. And then two, so long as people are willing to understand that science is not some settled truth, but a search for truth, and the process used for searching for truth is more important than the destination, I believe that science can be a friend of liberty.
Blaming 5G or other things for the spread of coronavirus is just, human nature, as you said. People always want to find reasons to think something must be caused by something they can't actually, identify physically. But I mean, that's on the side. But I want to go to Martin real quick. So we have a question from one of our friends in East Africa, is Levin Karanja. He says, it's about your opinion on the role of law. So he said, if you were considering if you were condemning state power, what would you advise to be the ideal role of the government? So he's, just trying to say, since you are anti, explosion of government power or state of emergency powers, what then will be your ideal role of the government in this kind of situation, Martin?
I mean, it's extremely difficult for libertarians like myself. We always like to say that government's role must be limited very exclusively to the protection of life, liberty, and property. And when we say that, we usually have in mind protecting people against crime, violence, war, etc. And we tend to argue around health emergencies. It's very difficult. I won't claim to have any kind of golden bullet answer here. I guess I would start with just, as I've mentioned earlier, having a real culture of skepticism of government power. I don't think anything can beat that. You can have the best institutions on paper, you can have the best constitutions, but nothing will beat a culture of constitutionalism, which I think, unfortunately, is something that Africa lacks almost totally, including South Africa. Our constitutionalism is something that's very much limited to certain suburbanites in city centers and the courts, whereas the vast overwhelming majority of South Africans really could not care less, and I can understand that to an extent because there are bigger fish to fry, putting food on the table, etc. In other countries like the United States, I think there's a very strong culture of constitutionalism, and that is why you have a very strong lobby or movement, at least, criticizing how the Trump administration and how state governments have responded to COVID-19. But yeah, that is where I would start. I guess my next step would be to very clearly set out what the government, if we concede the principle that government does have a role to play in a pandemic, I would be very specific in writing the constitution of the government on what it can do in the case of a pandemic. And to an extent, the South African constitution achieves this. When there's a state of emergency, which includes a natural disaster like the COVID-19, the president has to declare a state of emergency, and that sets in motion a set of safeguards. But then again, the president has not declared a state of emergency. They've declared something called a state of disaster, and that is not governed by the same constitutional provision. So already we have this situation where the constitution is quite clear about what should have happened, and the government just ignored that. And one of the people in the chat from Malawi actually mentioned the case in Malawi where opposition groups went to court and got an injunction or an interdict against the government to not implement a lockdown. I remember reading about this. And then the government said, well, that's nice. We're going to do it anyway. And that's totally unacceptable. I mean, that's what you cannot have. And when that happens, that is when there's a real need for the people, ordinary people, to stand up and say, well, with that goes the legitimacy of this government. And it's time for an election or what have you. But you cannot replace having a very vigilant citizenry. And I guess the important question is, how do you get there? I think the inclination is always to say education, but what I would say is narrative. We need to have a very appealing narrative and a very good story to tell about the history of governments simply rolling roughshod over people's freedom. And we need to put this in a very convincing and relatable way, because in many ways it's in the history of every African on this continent, history of severe government repression. And we need to keep telling this story, keep reminding people that this is what happened, this is what is still happening. And unless we take a very active role in watching government, minding government, and playing a very active role in the civic religion, I guess, for lack of a better word, building a tradition of limited government around the institution, then it's going to happen again. For that, we do need narrative.
Question to Dr. Foretia, I guess, from Mike Mungo from Ottawa. He said, I think this question's about, he's pretty much ahead of time, but regardless, he's saying, what do you consider to be the most important factors to opening Africa after COVID-19? More COVID testings, antibody testings, or what other measures do you think, Dr. Foretia?
That's a great question. I mean, when we start thinking of how you deal with COVID-19 and how Africa, deals with it, the question it becomes, what is your diagnosis of it? Is this a 1 in a 100-year, 1 in a century event, or is it something that will recur sooner? How are you as Africa, going to prepare yourself for the world after COVID-19? Would depend on what you diagnose COVID-19 and its effect on the world as of today. So if it's disrupting, but not to the level at which it is considered, sand having shifted underneath our feet and there is a new normal, then there will be a tendency to go back to the old ways. And frankly, I personally have been not very impressed by the way African leaders in general have approached the problem, the pandemic. And I think while they've had, the AU has been involved, they've not been that level of international continental wide engagement, deep engagement in really seeing how this is affecting and will affect our economies for the long haul, and how we should adapt to it. So I think it would really depend as to what we diagnose. But it will be important to state that our countries, face lots of structural problems. And I think the most important structural problem for our economies is the fact that we do not have shared governance, and from an issue of lack of serious institutions. And it's why I appreciate and I respect the Ghanaian people a lot, because even though they do criticize and they have problems, for the most part, for the last 20 years, they've done great. And I know Brian may disagree, but, from where I sit, there is a level of, back and forth that goes between the Ghanaian government, the civil society, the legal apparatus, the scientists, that ensures that government is checked and can actually learn some lessons from situations like this. And I was very glad when Franklin, and the Imani team from pushing, the whole issue of ports in Ghana and the systems that were to be implemented, and fighting government to ensure that the right kind of systems were put in place. So it would be very important, and I'll argue that the way forward for us when we think about the post-COVID-19 is whether we remain and our countries remain extractive countries, or our countries decide to be open economies, and open economies where we can actually bring more voices up and to better appreciate the diversity and how to respond. And that is the way that we would ensure that our systems are stronger. But we face currently, and I'll use 1 minute to say this, we face currently significant challenges regarding our physical space and what governments can do to respond to the crisis. Because as you all know, in many countries, 60 to 90% of the economy is informal. And this degree of informality makes it practically difficult for governments to get, there are really no safety nets in this group of the population. And so how do you enforce a lockdown when you cannot, do quantitative easing, and you cannot provide resources to the people who are being locked down? That's a totally different question. How do you deal in a situation where oil prices have dramatically fallen, and countries like Nigeria, who created budgets based on a barrel of oil at 50, at $50 a barrel, are now dealing with $25 or less a barrel? How do you respond to that? How do you respond to the fact that COVID-19 has led to and will lead to significant drops in remittances to African countries? And in 2017, the Nigerians abroad remitted more than 19 billion to Nigeria, and that was almost equivalent to the Nigerian budget. So in the post-COVID-19 world, how do you, where we are in a deep recession, how do we, depression, so to speak, how do we, adapt ourselves to come out of it? And I think those are real structural problems that we have in our African countries. But I do not believe that those structural problems can be addressed by government. I think they will be addressed by citizens who hold governments accountable, and a government where it allows citizens to be innovative. It's open up where the Ghanaians can decide that to do pool testing is better, and they can push that, rather than following up on the mandate from the state that says right now we are listening to the Africa CDC and it's saying no pool testing as of now. But if Ghanaians can say no, we understand that, but we know that pool testing is better and we can use it better, that's another way to go about it. The fact that lastly, overnight, every African country is able to produce face masks, something that before COVID-19, you would have waited for it to be imported. How do you create dynamic economies will be the challenge that we'll face, and it will be for all of us all to be able to expand the space of ideas and knowledge to be able to hold governments accountable, because governments, for the most part, will take, it's like water, they will go through the easy route, rather than do difficult things. That's just human nature. So we have to make them do difficult things.
I'm going to come back to Mr. Bright about the question of the informal sector, but I just want Mr. Denis to sort of help us answer this question real quick. From Emmanuel, he said, recently the president of Madagascar announced that it had discovered an organic treatment and prevention for the novel coronavirus. There are other claims in Nigeria where a governor claimed to have recovered from the virus by taking a range of local herbs. In the light of these, and bearing in mind the economic and health infrastructural disposition of many African countries, Dr. Denis, what is your take on the move to relax the lockdown in Nigeria? I don't know, Doctor, if you can help us just answer that in like a minute.
Well, my response to that is that, and it will echo what I've said earlier regarding science. Now, if you wake up and tell me that I have discovered something, I want to test that thing. It's the same way, folks were talking about hydroxychloroquine and its effect. I want to test it because if you discover something, that is a cure. It tells me that if I give it to 100 people, it should react. I should be able to predict how those 100 people will react to that. It's like saying that somebody has, headache, and you give them paracetamol, and the headache doesn't get better. Now, the president of Madagascar, is right. Let's assume it's a free country. It's okay for him to claim to have discovered. Now, it's for us to be able to, figure out whether the treatment he has discovered is actually, true, or it just works the same way as drinking water. Right now, I cannot tell you that it is true. So I will not be prescribing it to any of my patients.
I just hope, the President of the United States can emulate your opinion on testing vaccines or, potential remedies for this virus, because he's one of the persons that have been pushing this, unconfirmed therapeutic solutions to the virus, like hydroxychloroquine, or people injecting themselves with with pesticide or an antibacterial. Anyways, the question here, Mr. Simmons, is about the informal sector. Okay, we know that the majority of Africans that are affected by this lockdown are, of course, people in the informal economy. So, how do you expect, or how would you help us, understand how this section of Africans could possibly survive amidst this lockdown, and of course opening back the economy?
To answer your question, Ibrahim, I feel that very often the way in which a lot of people, a lot of commentators categorize informal and formal needs a bit of work. So I have looked at this for quite a while, and it appears as if the emphasis is on whether a particular business is in some kind of government database or not. And a lot of the analysis then goes around, how many of these businesses are in government databases, either in terms of incorporation or registration or taxation or something like that. The truth is, if you look carefully at African situations, in the African setting, informality is a feature. It's a behavior pattern. It's not a status. So there are a lot of companies that are formally registered and are perhaps even registered for tax, but they don't behave like formal businesses in the sense that they don't have permanent employees, or even if they do, these employees are just employees in name. A lot of the cases, you have situations where people will typically oscillate or modulate their formality and informality depending on circumstances. So it's the famous go and get a document for something else. So when they need to get a contract, they go and get a tax certificate. When they need to get approval for something, or they need to demonstrate employees, they go and get a social security certificate. But in between those processes, they don't really act like formal business. If we accept that formality and informality are features, and that supposedly formal businesses exhibit informal behavior, we change the nature of the way that we are looking at the problem. And I think that it becomes less, how do you, for instance, isolate a part of the economy and describe it as informal, and begin to consider the capacity of operators in that economy beyond their material status. What do I mean by that? When you take a startup in the Western sense of a startup, and then you take an SME in the African developing world sense of an SME, you see dramatic differences. And a lot of that difference is from attitude, is from aptitude, and it's from skill set. Now, I am a bit worried that in a lot of the relief that is being proposed for SMEs across the continent, the emphasis is exclusively on material support. So can we get them some loans? Can we get them some grants? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it misunderstands the situation, forgetting that in a lot of instances, the reason why one company is a startup and therefore is potentially a Facebook, and the reason why another company is an SME and is trapped in the informal sector in Africa, It's more about aptitude and attitude than it is about some absolute classification. So in that regard, some of our colleagues are working to see whether it will be possible for the large numbers of MBA students and other students of other categories that cannot take up their summer internships, cannot do their summer attachments. Can we divert the energies of some of these people to address the issue of skills and capacity development in the SME and informal sector? Can we have the same thing done by business faculty, who now, because universities are sharp, have extra time on their hands because the online platforms are not very effective, and a lot of the time the workload has reduced because assignments cannot be distributed over the platform and the likes of it. This attitude, this approach to the problem, to my mind, will be very critical to seeing whether we are giving the skills that SMEs and informal sector operators need to navigate a crisis. So if you think of the formal sector, and you think of a company that is having difficulty due to a recession or whatever in the US, you will typically find that private equity people will buy the company, change management, and make radical surgery to the business to improve it. Why? Because it's often believed that you need skills, you need aptitude, you need a whole bunch of other things beyond money to get a business running and to get a business into a successful zone. And I think we don't apply the same thinking when it comes to SMEs in Africa. We think it's all about loss of revenue and loss of income, and has got very little to do with how do we equip them so that they are better at pivoting, they are better at all of these other things that businesses in crisis everywhere else and in other contexts are required to do. So that would be my advice, that we don't just focus on the material relief, but we also focus on skills and capacity to navigate the crisis and the post-crisis period.
We're already running out of time, so I want Martin to help us bring things home now. So Martin, in this discussion are think tank leaders, civil service, personnel, advocates, organizers, and regular Africans. So what we suggest for us to do, in checking the excesses of the government during this period? What are the measures do you think ordinary citizens or think tanks can, undertake to keep that, subjection of the government to the rule of law at this, point in time, Martin?
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to a point I made earlier briefly, and that is we need to construct a good narrative. We need to, what the media consultants often call it, we need to get away from themes and get to issues. And we need to make these issues relatable to the people we're aiming them at. And we shouldn't be general. We shouldn't be generalists. We shouldn't go to citizens and say, freedom is good, please support us. We need to be concrete. We need to tell them what government, specifically in that society, but in general, has done. And we should stop lumping praise on government. I would say totally, in general. We should have nothing good to say about government, even where the government acts legitimately. The left, for lack of a better term, let's say socialists, authoritarians, have mastered this. They don't have anything good to say about companies, about the private sector, even though they benefit so gloriously from what the private sector does. Our liberal obsession with always being factually and clinically correct, I think, undermines us. And we really need to get around to going into communities and saying that, listen, what the government has done has hurt you personally. This is how. It has hurt your family, it has hurt your society, it has hurt your community. And we need to keep telling that story. We need to get into stories because this is what people respond to. So to bring that back specifically to COVID-19, I'm not sure how, but it will definitely have something to do with how government seizes power in the midst of an emergency. We need to really ram that point home, make sure people understand that. And this may be a problem specifically in South Africa, but there's this idea that these restrictions are the only people complaining about them are these wealthy middle-class people who want poor people to die. We need to definitely put that silly idea to bed, because what is happening is that these interventions, mostly the economic ones, are totally devastating on poor Africans and poor South Africans. Because their job is essential for them, yet government has said it's non-essential. We need to tell the story that an essential job is any job that puts food on the table. That is a narrative point that we can and should make. And if once we've mastered this, once we've gotten around to finally having a compelling narrative that people can buy into in the same way that American settlers bought into their, call it, libertarian narrative a few hundred years ago, they've also lost that. Then we can finally actually get around to really limiting government. We can't put the cart before the horse and write great constitutions.
Absolutely.
And establish think tanks without doing this grunt work. And it's hard work, but it needs to be done.
You're such a hardliner, Martin. I wish I could, emulate your hardline libertarianism or classical liberalism. So the question is from one of our friends in Nigeria, Olufemi Ajayi. He says, regarding the Madagascar's formula for fighting COVID-19, I feel there is a westernization of knowledge in this regard. If Madagascar's claim for cure or formula to fixing the problem, nothing stopped WHO to request for these formula and tests. It's like whatever comes from Europe, America, and recently China seems to be accepted, but from Africa is a no-no. What do you think, Dr. Foretia?
My quick response to that is that personally, I did not accept the and the Plaquenil. There was no evidence to back that up substantively, and after the assertion that Plaquenil was very effective against COVID-19, it was tested, and so far it hasn't stood the test of time. So I think it's the same thing with the president of Madagascar. As of now, I don't have evidence to support it, except the word of a president, and now the word of a president to me is not scientific. So I am not giving it as though it's the word of a president that is reading research that they have studied for it. Now it is for us to be able to say this is what is the cure for COVID-19, and it should be tested, and we should look at it and figure out whether it's effective or not before we can. Before I myself will be willing to prescribe it to other patients. Now, if somebody is going to, take the opportunity to order it up directly from the president and use it as a cure, now it's a free world, so they are free to do that. But I cannot say that there is evidence to back it as a cure for it. So I want to draw that line, saying that it's not I'm not approaching it from a westernization of medicine, but pretty much from a scientific standpoint.
Absolutely. It's certainly in times like this that some sub-debates, subcultural, political debates tend to unfold and help us make sense of, our relations with our, other human beings across the world. But I want to thank everybody for joining us for this discussion. It's been a fascinating time having everybody here. Dr. Foretia, Mr. Simmons from Ghana, and Martin from South Africa. Thank you, and thank you to all our participants.